Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science channel. Tonight, we'll be looking downward into the quiet and ancient world of moss, a place filled with green, with patience, and endless resilience. Beneath our feet and clinging to every surface are these small plants, soft carpets covering stones, draped over fallen logs and nestled between tree roots. But there is so much more than meets the eye. Some mosses have survived unchanged for millions of years, their forms perfected long ago. A simple patch may contain thousands of individual plants working together, and the gentle cushion you see may be decades or even centuries old. Moss is both humble and extraordinary, something we overlook every day yet never ceases to amaze when we pause to notice. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, I invite you to like and subscribe, or share a simple thought down in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest, settle in, and allow the calm of the moss world to carry you. Let's begin. The ancient origins. Moss belongs to one of the oldest plant groups on Earth. When you kneel down and touch a patch of moss, you are touching a form of life that has existed for more than 400 million years. Long before flowering plants emerged, before trees grew tall, moss already covered the land. These tiny plants were among the first to leave the water and colonize the harsh, empty continents. They transformed barren rock into fertile ground, paving the way for all plant life that followed. Fossils show that ancient mosses looked remarkably similar to those we see today. While other plants evolved dramatically, growing taller, developing flowers, and creating seeds, moss remained largely unchanged. It found its perfect form early and saw no reason to alter it. This makes moss a living link to Earth's distant past, a survivor that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless species. To see moss is to glimpse what the world looked like when it was still young and green, a world without roots. Moss does not have true roots like other plants. Instead of sending roots deep into soil, moss anchors itself with tiny thread-like structures called rhizoids. These delicate filaments grip surfaces, holding the plant in place against wind and water. But they do not draw nutrients from the ground the way tree roots do. Moss absorbs everything it needs directly through its leaves, taking moisture and minerals from rain, fog, and even the air itself. This simple design allows moss to grow almost anywhere. It clings to bare rock where no soil exists, drapes over tree bark, and spreads across old concrete. It needs no rich earth, no deep foundation, just a surface to hold on to, and enough moisture to survive. This makes moss one of nature's most adaptable colonizers, able to thrive in places other plants cannot reach. While trees send roots searching deep below, moss lives entirely on the surface, content with what falls from above. The smallest forests. A single square inch of moss can contain hundreds of individual plants. What looks like a uniform carpet is actually a dense community of tiny stems and leaves, packed tightly together. Each plant is small, often just a few millimeters tall, but together they create a miniature forest. If you could shrink yourself down and walk through a moss patch, you would find yourself surrounded by towering stems, layered canopies of leaves, and a complex landscape of valleys and ridges. Within this small world lives an entire ecosystem. Water collects between the stems, creating pools and streams at a microscopic scale. Tiny insects crawl through the undergrowth. Microscopic creatures, called tardigrades, also known as water bears, make their homes here, grazing on moss cells. Even smaller organisms, bacteria and fungi, live among the roots and leaves, breaking down organic matter. The moss provides shelter, food, and moisture for countless forms of life. To overlook moss is to miss an entire universe existing just beneath your notice. Masters of moisture. Moss can absorb more than 20 times its dry weight in water. One of moss's most remarkable abilities is its relationship with water. The leaves are designed to capture and hold moisture with incredible efficiency. When rain falls or fog settles, moss swells, its tissues filling with water like a sponge. This stored moisture allows it to survive long periods without rain. As the environment dries, moss releases water slowly, creating a humid microclimate around itself. This makes moss a natural regulator of moisture in forests and other ecosystems. After a rainstorm, while other surfaces dry quickly, moss remains damp for days, providing drinking water for insects and small animals. In some forests, moss holds so much water that it prevents soil erosion, absorbing the impact of rainfall and releasing it gradually into streams. Moss turns every surface it covers into a reservoir, a living sponge that smooths out the extremes of wet and dry. Growing without seeds. Moss reproduces through spores, like ferns and fungi. Unlike flowering plants that produce seeds, moss creates millions of microscopic spores. These dust-like particles are so small and light, they can travel on the slightest breeze, floating through the air like invisible clouds. When a spore lands in a suitable spot, damp and shaded, it begins to grow. First, it forms a green thread, called a protonema, which looks like a tiny web of algae. From this thread, small buds develop, eventually growing into the leafy moss plants we recognize. The process is slow and patient, taking weeks or months to complete. Moss also reproduces in simpler ways. A small fragment broken off by wind or passing animals can grow into a new plant if it lands somewhere moist. This means that a single moss colony can spread gradually, generation after generation, without ever producing spores. It is reproduction at its most elemental, requiring nothing but a piece of the parent plant and a place to grow. The softness beneath your feet. Moss creates some of the softest natural surfaces on Earth. Walking on a thick bed of moss feels like stepping on a plush carpet. The cushion beneath your feet is created by thousands of tiny plants pressed together, their leaves overlapping to form a dense, springy mat. This softness serves a purpose beyond comfort. It protects the moss itself from being crushed, the layers of plants absorbing the impact of footsteps, falling branches, and even landslides. In forests, moss covers rocks and logs that would otherwise be hard and slippery. It transforms harsh surfaces into gentle ones, making the forest floor kinder to the creatures that walk across it. For small animals, moss provides a soft landing when they fall from trees or leap between stones. For humans, it offers a rare moment of tenderness in nature, a place where the earth seems to welcome you. To lie down on moss is to rest on something alive, something that yields and supports you with equal grace, a palette of greens. Moss comes in dozens of shades of green, from bright lime to deep emerald. Not all moss looks the same. Some species glow with a vibrant yellow-green, catching the light like tiny lanterns. Others are dark and velvety, almost black in shadow. The color depends on the species, the amount of sunlight, and even the season. In spring, moss often appears bright and fresh, its new growth pushing up through older layers. In autumn, some mosses take on bronze or golden tones as they prepare for winter. The variation in color creates a subtle palette across the forest floor, a patchwork of greens that shifts as you move through the landscape. Artists and dyers have long admired moss for its color, though the plants themselves are too small and slow-growing to harvest sustainably. Instead, moss remains a visual gift, a reminder that even in the simplest plant, nature creates beauty in endless variation, the silence of growth. Moss grows so slowly, you could watch it for hours and see no change. Unlike fast-growing plants that shoot up in days or weeks, moss measures its growth in millimeters per year. A patch that looks thick and lush may have taken decades to reach that size. Some moss colonies growing on rocks in cold climates expand by less than a millimeter each year. This means a patch the size of your hand could be older than you are. The slowness of moss is part of its patience. It does not rush to claim space or compete aggressively with neighbors. It simply persists, adding a few new leaves each season, gradually spreading across stone and wood. This slow growth makes moss vulnerable to disturbance. A footstep that crushes it may destroy years of growth. But it also makes moss remarkably resilient. Because it grows slowly, it is adapted to survive in harsh conditions where faster plants would struggle. Moss is proof that success does not require speed. Living on air and rain. Moss needs no soil because it feeds on what falls from the sky. Most plants depend on rich soil filled with nutrients. But moss is different. It draws everything it needs from the atmosphere. Rain carries dissolved minerals, dust particles, and nutrients leached from leaves and bark above. Fog delivers moisture directly to moss leaves, which absorb it immediately. Even air pollution, though harmful to many plants, provides moss with nitrogen and other elements. This ability to live on air and rain makes moss independent of the ground beneath it. It can grow on glass, metal, plastic, or any surface that stays damp enough. In cities, moss covers statues, rooftops, and walls, finding sustenance in rainwater and urban dust. In forests, it drapes over branches high above the soil, never touching the ground. Moss is a plant that has learned to harvest the sky, turning every raindrop into food and every foggy morning into a feast. The green glow of wet moss. When moss is wet, it seems to glow with an inner light. After rain, moss transforms. The water brings out the deepest, richest greens, and the plants seem to radiate color. This glow comes from the way water fills the cells, making them translucent and allowing light to pass through the layers of leaves. Sunlight filtering through wet moss creates a luminous effect, as though the plants are lit from within. In shadowy forests, this glow becomes even more pronounced. A patch of moss on a dark log can seem to shine, drawing the eye and creating focal points in the dim understory. Photographers seek out wet moss for this quality, knowing that the colors will be most vivid just after rain. For those walking through the woods, the glow of wet moss is a small magic, a reminder that water and light together can turn even the simplest plant into something radiant. Moss and the cycle of decay. Moss helps break down fallen trees and return them to the soil. When a tree falls in the forest, moss is often the first plant to colonize it. Spores land on the bark, finding the damp wood ideal for growth. As the moss spreads, it holds moisture against the log, speeding up the decay process. Fungi and bacteria thrive in the damp environment created by moss, breaking down the wood fiber by fiber. Over years and decades, the log softens, crumbles, and eventually becomes part of the soil. The moss acts as both blanket and nursery, protecting the decaying wood while providing habitat for the organisms that do the work of decomposition. In this way, moss is an essential part of the forest's nutrient cycle. It ensures that nothing is wasted, that every fallen giant is gradually transformed and returned to the earth to nourish new growth. To see moss covering a log is to witness renewal in progress. Cushions and carpets. Different species of moss create different textures and forms. Some mosses grow in tight, rounded cushions that look like green pincushions scattered across rocks. These cushion mosses are dense and compact, their stems growing upward in a tight cluster. Other species spread horizontally, forming flat carpets that flow over the ground like a green tide. Feather mosses have delicate, branching stems that create a soft, feathery texture. Haircap mosses stand upright with stiff stems, resembling a miniature forest of tiny trees. Each growth form is an adaptation to different conditions. Cushion mosses thrive in exposed places, where their compact shape helps them retain moisture. Carpet mosses prefer sheltered spots, where they can spread without drying out. The variety of forms makes moss endlessly interesting to observe, each species creating its own small landscape. The temperature of moss. Moss helps regulate temperature in the forest. On hot summer days, moss stays cool. Its water content acts as insulation, keeping the surface beneath it several degrees cooler than exposed soil or rock. This cooling effect creates refuges for insects, salamanders, and other small creatures seeking relief from heat. In winter, moss provides insulation in the opposite direction, trapping air in its dense structure and creating a buffer against freezing temperatures. Seeds and insects sheltering under moss are protected from the worst cold. This temperature regulation extends to the larger environment as well. Forests with abundant moss tend to have more stable temperatures, the moss covering moderating extremes and creating a gentler microclimate. In this way, moss shapes the conditions around it, making the forest more hospitable for countless forms of life. Moss in the rain. The sound of rain falling on moss is softer than on any other surface. When rain strikes bare ground or rocks, it makes a sharp, percussive sound. But when it falls on moss, the sound is muffled, gentle, almost silent. The soft, layered structure of moss absorbs the impact of each drop, turning what could be noise into whisper. Walking through a moss-covered forest during rain is a study in quiet. Water drips from leaves above, landing on the moss below with barely a sound. The air fills with the smell of wet earth and growing things, but the acoustic landscape remains hushed. This quietness is part of what makes moss-covered places feel peaceful. The moss softens not just the surface, but the soundscape, creating an atmosphere of calm. For those seeking stillness, a mossy forest in the rain is one of nature's most soothing places. Ancient moss, ancient stones. Moss grows on stones that have stood for thousands of years. In rocky landscapes, moss and stone form a partnership that spans millennia. The moss colonizes bare rock, its rhizoids gripping into tiny crevices. As it grows and dies, season after season, it creates a thin layer of organic matter on the stone's surface. This slowly accumulating layer helps other plants gain a foothold, gradually transforming rock into soil. But the process is incredibly slow. On hard granite or basalt, moss may grow for centuries before enough soil accumulates for other plants to establish. Some moss-covered stones have been colonized for thousands of years, the moss colonies passing through countless generations, while the stone beneath remains largely unchanged. To touch moss growing on an ancient stone is to touch a partnership between the living and the non-living, between the quick rhythm of plant life and the slow patience of geology. The moss of mountaintops. High-altitude moss survives in some of Earth's harshest conditions. On mountaintops and Arctic tundra, where trees cannot grow and even grass struggles, moss thrives. These high-altitude species are specially adapted to extreme conditions: intense sunlight, strong winds, freezing temperatures, and thin air. They grow in compact cushions their tight structure protecting them from desiccation and cold. During winter, they may be buried under snow for months, entering a dormant state until spring returns. When the snow melts, they quickly resume growth, making the most of the brief summer. Alpine moss grows so slowly that some patches are believed to be among the oldest living plants on Earth, with ages measured in centuries or even millennia. Their survival in such harsh places is a testament to moss's resilience. Where almost nothing else can live, moss finds a way. Moss and clean water. Moss acts as a natural water filter in streams and forests. As water flows over moss-covered rocks in a stream, the moss traps sediment, particles, and pollutants. Its dense structure acts like a living filter, cleaning the water as it passes through. Moss also absorbs heavy metals and other contaminants, removing them from the water and storing them in its tissues. This makes moss an important indicator of water quality. Scientists study moss in streams to assess pollution levels, knowing that the plants will reflect the chemistry of the water flowing over them. In forests, moss filters rainwater before it enters streams and aquifers, improving the quality of groundwater. This filtering capacity is yet another way moss contributes to healthy ecosystems. It purifies water not through any conscious effort, but simply by being itself, by growing where water flows and absorbing what passes by. The glow of bioluminescent moss. Some moss glows faintly in very dark conditions, a phenomenon scientists are still studying. While rare, certain mosses in deep caves and very dark forests have been reported to emit a faint glow. This bioluminescence, if confirmed, would come from symbiotic bacteria or fungi living on the moss rather than from the moss itself. The glow is barely visible to human eyes, requiring complete darkness to perceive. But for insects and other creatures that navigate by light, even this faint glow might serve as a beacon. Most moss does not glow, but the possibility that some species might adds another layer of mystery to these ancient plants. Imagine a forest so dark that the only light comes from moss, a green phosphorescence marking the safest paths through the undergrowth. Whether myth or reality, the idea of glowing moss captures the imagination, reminding us that even the most familiar plants may still hold secrets. Moss gardens of Japan. In Japanese culture, moss gardens are spaces for meditation and reflection. The Japanese have cultivated moss for centuries, creating gardens where dozens of species grow in carefully tended arrangements. These gardens are designed to evoke natural moss-covered forests, but with enhanced beauty and intention. Paths wind through landscapes of green, passing over moss-covered stones and beneath moss-draped trees. The gardens change subtly with seasons and weather, appearing brightest after rain and taking on muted tones in dry periods. Visitors walk slowly, observing the variations in texture and color, the play of light and shadow. Moss gardens embody principles of simplicity and impermanence central to Japanese aesthetics. They require patience to create and patience to appreciate, rewarding slow observation with quiet beauty. In these gardens, moss becomes more than a plant. It becomes a medium for contemplation, a living art that asks nothing but that you slow down and notice. The scent of moss. Moss has a subtle, earthy smell, especially noticeable after rain. While moss itself is nearly scentless when dry, wet moss releases a distinctive fragrance. It smells of earth, of green growing things, of humidity and shade. The scent comes from organic compounds released by the moss, and from the rich community of microorganisms living among its leaves and stems. In a forest thick with moss, the smell after rain is unmistakable, a deep, loamy aroma that speaks of life and decay happening simultaneously. This scent triggers memory and emotion in many people, associated with time spent in nature, with childhood explorations, with peace and solitude. Perfumers have tried to capture it, blending earthy notes with green and aquatic elements, but natural moss scent remains subtle and elusive. It is not a fragrance that demands attention, but one that seeps into awareness slowly, like the moss itself. Moss as medicine. Traditional medicine has used moss for its antibacterial properties. Throughout history, people have recognized moss's healing potential. Sphagnum moss, which grows in bogs and wetlands, was used as wound dressing for centuries. It is highly absorbent and contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth, making it an effective natural bandage. During World War I, when medical supplies ran short, sphagnum moss was harvested and used to dress soldiers' wounds. Indigenous peoples around the world incorporated various moss species into their healing practices, using them to treat cuts, burns, and infections. Modern research has confirmed that some mosses do indeed have antibacterial and antifungal properties. While moss is no longer commonly used in medicine, having been replaced by more effective synthetic materials, its historical role reminds us that plants have long served humanity in quiet, essential ways. The resilience of desiccation. Moss can survive being completely dried out, reviving when water returns. One of moss's most remarkable abilities is desiccation tolerance. Many species can lose almost all their water content, drying to a crisp brown state that looks dead. In this dormant condition, moss can survive for months or even years. When rain finally comes, the plants absorb water and within hours or days return to vibrant green, resuming photosynthesis as though nothing had happened. This ability allows moss to colonize places with unpredictable rainfall, surviving long droughts that would kill most other plants. The mechanism involves special proteins and sugars that protect cellular structures during drying, preventing permanent damage. Watching dried moss revive after rain is like witnessing resurrection. What looked lifeless suddenly lives again, transforming from brown to green in a matter of hours. It is a reminder that survival sometimes means surrendering completely, trusting that conditions will eventually improve. Moss on trees. Moss growing on tree bark does not harm the tree. A common misconception is that moss damages the trees it grows on, but this is not true. Moss is not a parasite. It does not send roots into the bark to steal nutrients. Instead, it simply uses the tree as a surface to cling to, drawing all its needs from air and rain. In fact, moss can benefit trees by helping to retain moisture on the bark and by providing habitat for insects that prey on tree pests. The presence of moss on a tree is often a sign of good air quality and adequate humidity, conditions favorable to both moss and tree. Old trees in healthy forests are often heavily covered in moss, the thick green coating adding to their ancient appearance. Far from being harmful, moss is simply a fellow resident of the forest, sharing space with trees in a relationship of mutual tolerance. The colors of autumn moss. In autumn, some mosses take on bronze and golden hues. While moss is associated with green, seasonal changes can alter its appearance. As temperatures drop and daylight wanes, certain species produce pigments that give them a bronze, copper, or even reddish tint. These colors may help protect the moss from frost damage or excess light. In autumn forests, when most plants are losing their leaves and fading, moss often looks especially vibrant, its unusual colors standing out against fallen leaves. The contrast between golden moss and red maple leaves, or between bronze moss and the gray of bare branches, creates striking visual compositions. For those who pay attention, autumn moss offers a quieter, subtler beauty than the brilliant foliage above. It is a beauty that rewards close observation, revealed only to those who kneel down and look carefully. Winter moss. Moss remains green under snow, photosynthesizing when conditions allow. When winter comes and snow blankets the forest, moss does not die. Instead, it enters a state of dormancy, waiting beneath the white cover. On warmer days, when sunlight penetrates the snow, moss can actually photosynthesize through the icy layer, creating food from light that filters down. When spring arrives and the snow melts, moss is among the first plants to resume active growth, its green already present and ready. Some species are specially adapted to cold, continuing to grow at temperatures just above freezing. In northern forests, moss can photosynthesize through much of the winter, making use of brief, warm spells. This winter activity gives moss an advantage over deciduous plants that must start from scratch each spring. By the time trees leaf out, moss has already been growing for weeks or months, having made the most of the cold season. Moss in urban spaces. Moss colonizes cities, finding niches in concrete landscapes. Even in urban environments, moss persists. It grows in sidewalk cracks, on old walls, between paving stones, and on any surface that stays damp. Urban moss is often different from forest species, adapted to tolerate pollution, foot traffic, and extreme temperature fluctuations. Some cities in rainy climates become famous for their moss-covered structures, the green coating softening the hard edges of concrete and stone. In Japan, urban moss is sometimes cultivated intentionally, covering walls and roofs in traditional buildings. In other places, moss is seen as a sign of neglect, something to be removed. But moss in cities serves important functions. It absorbs rainwater, reducing runoff. It filters air pollution, and it provides tiny patches of habitat for urban wildlife. Far from being out of place, moss in cities is a reminder that nature finds a way into even the most built-up environments. The weight of moss. A moss-covered log can weigh twice as much when the moss is wet. The water-holding capacity of moss adds significant weight to the surfaces it covers. A fallen tree that might be relatively light when dry becomes much heavier when covered in water-saturated moss. This weight has practical implications in forests. It makes moss-covered logs more stable, less likely to roll or shift. It also means that moss-covered slopes and cliffs are heavier after rain, sometimes contributing to landslides in unstable terrain. For creatures living in and around moss, this weight creates a more stable environment. The moss holds everything in place, creating a reliable structure that changes little from day to day. For humans trying to move moss-covered logs or rocks, the weight is noticeable, a reminder that what looks soft and light is actually laden with water. Moss as insulation. Traditionally, moss was used to insulate buildings in cold climates. Before modern insulation materials, people in northern regions used moss to keep their homes warm. Dried moss was stuffed between logs in cabin walls, filling gaps and blocking drafts. The structure of moss, with its many air pockets, made it an effective insulator, trapping heat inside while keeping cold out. Sphagnum moss was especially prized for this purpose, as it retained its structure when dried and did not decompose quickly. In Scandinavia and northern Russia, moss insulation was common for centuries. Even today, some traditional builders use moss in restoration projects, valuing its natural properties and historical authenticity. As insulation, moss was not just practical, but also renewable, harvested from nearby bogs and forests without need for manufacturing. It represents a time when building materials came directly from the landscape, when homes were made from what grew locally. The silence of moss-covered spaces. Moss absorbs sound, making moss-covered areas quieter. The soft, porous structure of moss dampens sound waves, absorbing noise rather than reflecting it. In a moss-covered forest, sounds seem muffled, conversation becomes hushed, and footsteps make almost no noise. This acoustic quality adds to the peaceful atmosphere of mossy places. It is one reason why such places feel meditative and calm. The moss quite literally silences the environment, creating a space where quiet comes naturally. Recording studios and concert halls sometimes use materials designed to mimic moss's sound-absorbing properties, though synthetic versions can never quite match the natural complexity. In nature, the silence created by moss is part of a larger sensory experience, combined with soft textures, muted colors, and the smell of damp earth. It is a silence that invites contemplation, that makes you speak in whispers without quite knowing why. Moss and fog. In foggy climates, moss thrives, drinking directly from the air. Fog is essentially a cloud touching the ground, droplets of water suspended in air. For moss, fog is a gift. The plants absorb moisture directly from fog, even without rain. In coastal regions and high-altitude cloud forests, fog provides most of the water moss needs. These foggy places often have the thickest, most luxuriant moss growth, with every surface draped in green. The moss, in turn, affects the fog, their surfaces catching droplets and causing them to coalesce and drip, effectively harvesting water from the air and delivering it to the ground. This fog drip can provide significant moisture to the ecosystem, especially during dry seasons, when fog is present, but rain is not. Moss and fog together create a cycle of moisture, each sustaining the other, together sustaining the forest. The age of moss colonies. Some moss colonies are thousands of years old. While individual moss plants are small and short-lived, colonies can persist for extraordinary lengths of time. As old plants at the center die, new plants grow at the edges, and the colony slowly expands. In stable environments, this process can continue for millennia. Arctic and alpine mosses growing on rock faces may be among the oldest organisms on Earth, with colony ages estimated at 2,000 years or more. These ancient colonies have witnessed the passage of countless generations of animals, weathered ice ages and warm periods, survived storms and droughts. To stand beside such a colony is to stand beside a living monument, something that has persisted through changes we can barely imagine. The age of moss reminds us that longevity does not always require size or complexity. Sometimes survival is simply a matter of patience and persistence. Moss in literature and art. Writers and artists have long been drawn to moss's quiet beauty. In poetry, moss represents age, patience, and the softening touch of time. It appears in descriptions of ancient forests, forgotten gardens, and neglected places slowly returning to nature. In Japanese haiku, moss is a seasonal word associated with age and tranquility. Painters depict moss as a mark of weathering, adding it to stones and trees to convey age and atmosphere. In fantasy literature, moss-covered ruins evoke mystery and forgotten history. The association between moss and time is nearly universal. Where moss grows thickly, time seems to slow. The presence of moss suggests that a place has been undisturbed long enough for this slow-growing plant to establish itself, that nature has had time to work its patient magic. In this way, moss becomes a symbol, representing values of stillness, longevity, and gentle persistence. The texture of different mosses. Each species of moss offers a unique texture to the touch. Some mosses feel like velvet, their leaves so fine and densely packed that running your hand over them is like stroking fabric. Others are coarser, with stiffer stems that prick gently at your fingers. Feather mosses are soft and springy, bouncing back after being pressed. Haircap mosses have a rougher texture, their upright stems creating a bristly surface. Peat mosses are exceptionally soft, almost spongy, and hold so much water that squeezing them releases a small stream. Touching moss connects you to its physical reality in a way that sight alone cannot. It is a tactile experience that invites slowness, that rewards gentle exploration. In a world of hard surfaces and synthetic materials, the varied textures of moss offer something increasingly rare: softness created by nature, texture that comes from life itself. Moss and lichens. Moss is often confused with lichen, but they are entirely different organisms. Lichen may grow alongside moss, sharing the same rocks and logs, and at first glance, they can look similar. But lichen is not a plant. It is a partnership between fungi and algae, or cyanobacteria, living together as one organism. Moss, by contrast, is a true plant with leaves and stems. Lichen tends to grow flatter and crustier, while moss is softer and more three-dimensional. Both thrive in similar conditions, and both indicate good air quality. Together, they create the colorful patchwork, often seen on stones and bark, mixing greens, grays, oranges, and yellows. Learning to distinguish moss from lichen takes practice, but once you know what to look for, the differences become clear. Each has its own beauty, its own ecological role. Together, they transform bare surfaces into living landscapes. Moss in fairy tales. In folklore, moss marks enchanted places and fairy dwellings. Old stories often describe moss-covered clearings as entrances to fairy realms, or moss-covered stones as fairy furniture. This association is understandable. Moss grows in the quiet, shadowy places that feel removed from the everyday world. It creates softness and mystery, transforming ordinary landscapes into something that feels otherworldly. A moss-covered boulder can look like a throne. A moss-draped log resembles a bridge to another realm. Children playing in forests have always recognized this, creating imaginary worlds among the moss. Even adults feel the pull of these places, sensing something special in the thick green carpets and the muffled quiet. Whether fairies are real or not, moss does create a boundary, marking spaces that feel set apart from normal life, where time moves differently and imagination flourishes. Photosynthesis in low light. Moss photosynthesizes efficiently even in deep shade. Most plants need bright sunlight to thrive, but moss has adapted to make the most of limited light. Its leaves are often just one cell thick, allowing every cell to capture what little light penetrates the forest canopy. Moss also contains high concentrations of chlorophyll, the green pigment that captures light energy. This allows it to photosynthesize in conditions so dim that other plants would starve. In the understory of dense forests, where only 1 or 2% of sunlight reaches the ground, moss carpets the soil. It thrives where almost nothing else can, turning the faintest glimmers of light into food. This efficiency explains why moss is so common in shaded places, from forest floors to the north sides of buildings where sunlight rarely reaches. For moss, even darkness is relative. As long as there is any light at all, it finds a way to grow. The revival of dried moss. Scientists study moss's revival mechanism to understand stress tolerance. The ability of moss to survive desiccation has attracted scientific interest. Researchers want to understand how moss protects its cells during drying and what triggers the revival process. By studying moss, they hope to learn strategies that could be applied to preserving other organisms, or even to protecting crops from drought. Moss achieves its resurrection through a combination of cellular mechanisms, producing protective proteins, replacing water with sugar molecules that stabilize membranes, and repairing any damage that occurs during drying. When water returns, these processes reverse, and the moss resumes normal function. Understanding this could help develop drought-resistant crops or better methods for storing biological materials. Moss, in its quiet way, may hold answers to some of agriculture's most pressing challenges. Its resilience, evolved over millions of years, contains lessons we are only beginning to learn. Moss and carbon storage. Peat moss stores vast amounts of carbon in bogs and wetlands. Sphagnum moss, which dominates peatlands, plays a crucial role in the global carbon cycle. As sphagnum grows, it creates acidic conditions that slow decomposition. When old moss dies, it does not decay completely. Instead, it compresses into peat, layer upon layer, century after century. These peat deposits can be meters deep, representing thousands of years of accumulated moss. The carbon that the moss captured from the atmosphere during its life remains locked in the peat, removed from the carbon cycle for millennia. Northern peatlands store more carbon than all the world's forests combined. This makes peat moss one of Earth's most important carbon sinks. Unfortunately, when peatlands are drained or burned, this stored carbon is released, contributing to climate change. Protecting peatlands and the moss that creates them is essential for maintaining the balance of atmospheric carbon, the green of spring moss. In spring, fresh moss growth creates the brightest greens in nature. As temperatures warm and daylight increases, moss produces new growth that is lighter and more vibrant than the older tissue below. These fresh green tips catch the light, making moss patches glow with an almost fluorescent brightness. In early spring, before trees leaf out, this new moss growth is one of the most vivid colors in the forest. It signals renewal, the return of growth after winter's dormancy. For creatures emerging from hibernation or returning from migration, the bright green of spring moss is a welcome sight, a sign that the lean months are over. For humans too, this fresh growth lifts spirits, reminding us that life persists, that growth returns, that the world turns green again. Spring moss embodies hope, the quiet certainty that no matter how long the winter, green will return. Moss on gravestones. Old cemeteries become gardens of moss, marking the passage of time. In graveyards, moss colonizes stone monuments, softening carved names and dates. This growth is not disrespectful but natural, a gentle reminder of time's passage. The moss that covers a century-old gravestone tells its own story, speaking of years of rain and shade, of quiet persistence. Some people find moss-covered graves melancholic, seeing in them abandonment and decay. Others find them peaceful, the green covering a kind of natural memorial, more lasting than flowers. In either case, moss transforms these spaces, making them part of the living landscape. The graves become integrated into nature, no longer standing apart, but becoming home to small plants and creatures. This is perhaps fitting. The moss reminds us that even stone returns to earth eventually, that nothing remains untouched by time, and that life continues, growing over and around what was. Moss and salamanders. Moss provides essential habitat for salamanders and other amphibians. In forests, salamanders spend much of their time hidden under moss, where the damp conditions keep their skin moist. These small amphibians cannot survive in dry environments, and moss creates the humid microhabitat they need. Under moss, salamanders hunt for insects, worms, and other tiny prey. They also lay their eggs in moss-covered areas, where moisture and shelter protect developing young. Some salamander species depend so heavily on moss that their populations decline when moss is removed or disturbed. The relationship goes both ways. Salamanders help control insect populations, including pests that might harm moss. They also contribute nutrients through their waste, enriching the moss colony. This partnership between moss and salamanders is one of countless relationships that make ecosystems function. Remove one element, and others suffer. Preserve moss, and you preserve salamanders. Preserve salamanders, and the forest remains in balance. The patience of moss. Moss teaches patience through its slow growth and quiet persistence. In a world obsessed with speed and immediate results, moss offers a different lesson. It grows slowly, spreads gradually, and achieves its goals through persistence rather than force. It does not compete aggressively with other plants, but finds niches others overlook. It does not demand attention but rewards those who take time to notice. Observing moss encourages a slower pace, a willingness to watch small changes unfold over time. It reminds us that growth does not have to be fast to be real, that small gains accumulate into significant achievements, that quiet persistence can outlast dramatic effort. In our own lives, cultivating moss-like patience might mean accepting that some goals take time, that not every effort shows immediate results, that steady work eventually leads to success. Moss does not hurry, and yet it covers the world. Moss in terrariums. Terrarium moss brings the forest's calm into indoor spaces. Growing moss in glass containers has become popular, creating miniature landscapes that require little care. Moss terrariums thrive in enclosed environments where humidity stays high. They need no fertilizer, infrequent watering, and tolerate low light. For people who love nature but lack outdoor space, a moss terrarium brings a piece of the forest indoors. Watching moss grow, even slowly, provides a connection to living processes. The tiny world inside the glass becomes a focus for meditation, a living artwork that changes gradually over time. Creating a terrarium also offers creative satisfaction, arranging moss, stones, and small plants into pleasing compositions. The result is both decoration and living ecosystem, a reminder that even in small, controlled spaces, nature can flourish. For those who find peace in moss, a terrarium offers daily access to that calm. The sound of footsteps on moss. Walking on thick moss creates a gentle, almost silent experience. Each step sinks slightly into the soft surface, the moss compressing and then slowly recovering. The feeling underfoot is unlike anything else in nature, cushioned and yielding, almost springy. There is no crunch of leaves, no crack of twigs, just a soft give and release. This silent walking changes the experience of moving through the forest. Without the noise of footsteps, you become more aware of other sounds. Bird calls, the rustle of wind in leaves, the distant murmur of water. You also become more stealthy, able to approach wildlife more closely. The silence invites contemplation, turning a walk into something more meditative. With each soft step, you feel connected to the moss itself, aware of the living surface beneath your feet, conscious of being supported by something delicate and ancient. It is walking that feels like floating, movement that leaves barely a trace. Moss and mushrooms. Mushrooms often fruit from moss-covered logs and soil. Moss provides ideal conditions for fungi, holding moisture and creating a stable substrate. Many mushroom species prefer to fruit from moss-covered wood, their mycelium spreading through the decaying material beneath. The combination of moss and mushrooms is visually striking, bright fungal caps emerging from green cushions, a contrast of textures and colors. This pairing also reveals the interconnected nature of forest life. The fungus decomposes wood, making nutrients available to moss and other plants. The moss holds moisture that helps mushrooms fruit. Together, they accelerate the breakdown of fallen trees, recycling nutrients and making space for new growth. For foragers and photographers, moss-covered logs dotted with mushrooms are treasured finds, offering both practical harvest and aesthetic pleasure. This partnership demonstrates how decay is not an end, but a transformation, with moss and mushrooms working together to turn death into new life. Moss in the rainforest. Tropical moss grows in extraordinary abundance, draping entire trees. In rainforests, where moisture is constant and shade is deep, moss reaches its most dramatic expression. It covers tree trunks from ground to canopy, hangs in thick curtains from branches, and carpets every fallen log. Some tropical mosses grow to unusual sizes, their stems reaching lengths impossible in drier climates. Epiphytic mosses, those growing on trees without touching the ground, create gardens in the air, collecting nutrients from rain and dust. The diversity of moss species in tropical forests exceeds that of any other biome, with dozens of species coexisting in a single tree. Walking through a moss-draped rainforest feels like entering a green cathedral. Everything softened and muted, the air heavy with moisture. Here, moss is not an accent, but a dominant presence, shaping the landscape as much as the trees themselves. The structure of moss leaves. Moss leaves are often just one cell thick, maximizing light capture. Unlike the leaves of flowering plants, which have multiple layers of tissue, moss leaves are incredibly simple. Many species have leaves consisting of a single layer of cells, with no internal air spaces or complex structures. This simplicity is an advantage in low light. Every cell is exposed to what light is available, and there is no interior tissue that must be supplied with food from surface cells. The thinness of moss leaves also allows them to dry quickly when moisture is scarce and revive rapidly when water returns. Looking at moss leaves under a microscope reveals an elegant efficiency, cells arranged in precise patterns, each one contributing to photosynthesis. This cellular simplicity, evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, proves that complex structures are not always necessary for success. Moss and butterflies. Some butterflies shelter in moss during cold or wet weather. While butterflies are creatures of sun and warmth, they sometimes need refuge from rain, wind, or unexpected cold. Moss provides such shelter. Its layered structure creates spaces where small insects can hide, protected from weather and predators. Butterflies crawling into moss become nearly invisible, their wings folded, their bodies tucked into the green. The moss also moderates temperature, staying warmer than exposed surfaces during cold snaps. When conditions improve, the butterflies emerge, dry and safe, ready to resume their activities. This use of moss as shelter extends to many insects. Beetles, spiders, and various larvae hide in moss, making it a crucial habitat for invertebrate diversity. A single patch of moss can house dozens of species, each finding food, shelter, or moisture among the tiny stems, the first land plants. Moss ancestors were among the first plants to colonize land. Before moss, life existed only in water. The transition to land was one of evolution's great challenges, requiring adaptations to prevent drying out, to support weight without water's buoyancy, and to reproduce without water to carry sperm to eggs. Early moss ancestors solved these problems with innovations still seen in modern mosses: a waxy coating to reduce water loss, rhizoids for anchoring, and a life cycle adapted to take advantage of moist conditions. These pioneering plants transformed Earth's surface, beginning the process of soil formation and creating conditions that allowed other plants to follow. Forests, grasslands, and all terrestrial ecosystems trace their origins to these early colonizers. When you look at moss, you are seeing a form of life that made land habitable, that paved the way for everything that came after. Moss color variation within species. A single moss species can appear different colors in different conditions. The same species, growing in full sun, may develop a yellowish tinge, while the same moss, in deep shade, appears dark green. This color variation helps the moss adapt to light levels, producing protective pigments when light is intense and maximizing chlorophyll when light is scarce. Moisture also affects color. Dry moss often appears lighter, sometimes brownish, while wet moss shows its deepest, richest hues. Seasonal changes, nutrient availability, and even the moss's age can influence its color. This variability can make identification challenging, as the same species may look quite different in different locations. But it also demonstrates moss's flexibility, its ability to adjust to local conditions. The moss does not change its fundamental nature, only its appearance, optimizing its physiology for the environment it finds itself in. Moss and birds. Birds use moss extensively for nest building. Many bird species line their nests with moss, valuing its softness and insulating properties. The moss cushions eggs, protecting them from hard twigs and branches. It also helps regulate temperature, keeping eggs warm but not overheated. Small forest birds like wrens and chickadees gather beakfuls of moss, weaving it into the structure of their nests. Larger birds use moss as a soft lining inside nests built primarily of sticks. Some species even use specific moss types, selecting species with particularly soft or water-resistant properties. Watching birds harvest moss reveals another connection in the web of forest life. The slow-growing moss supports birds, which in turn spread moss fragments to new locations, potentially helping it colonize new areas. This partnership, largely invisible to casual observation, is one of countless relationships that sustain healthy ecosystems. The touch of time. Ancient moss-covered stones carry a sense of timelessness. There is something moving about touching a moss-covered stone, knowing that the moss has grown there for decades or centuries. Your hand rests where countless seasons of growth have accumulated, where rain has fallen and sun has shone, where insects have crawled and birds have perched. The stone underneath is older still, perhaps millions of years old, and the moss is merely the latest chapter in its long story. This layering of time, stone beneath moss, years within years, gives these places a quality of permanence. The world may change rapidly around them, but here, time moves at moss speed, slow and steady. Touching such stones connects you to that longer timescale, reminding you that not everything rushes forward, that some things persist and endure. Moss on rooftops. Moss on roofs can protect or damage, depending on the material. On traditional thatched or wooden roofs, moss can help seal gaps and provide extra insulation. But on modern shingle roofs, moss can trap moisture, accelerating decay. On slate or tile roofs, moss is usually harmless, simply growing in the spaces between tiles where dust accumulates. Some traditional architecture incorporates moss intentionally, with certain Scandinavian and Japanese buildings featuring moss-covered roofs that last for decades. The moss in these cases is cultivated, trimmed, and cared for like a garden. Whether beneficial or problematic, moss on roofs indicates high humidity and shade, conditions that allow this moisture-loving plant to thrive even overhead. Looking up at a moss-covered roof, green and soft against the sky, you see nature's tendency to colonize every available surface, to find footholds in the least expected places. The chemistry of moss. Moss produces unique chemical compounds, some with potential medicinal value. As moss grows, it manufactures various organic compounds, some for protection against UV radiation, others to deter herbivores, and still others whose purpose remains unclear. Scientists have identified compounds in moss with antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. Some traditional medicines used moss extracts, and modern research is revisiting these uses with scientific methods. While no major medicines have yet come from moss, the potential remains. Each species produces its own unique chemistry, shaped by millions of years of evolution. These chemical defenses also give some mosses distinctive smells when crushed or bruised, releasing compounds into the air. The chemistry of moss is another hidden layer of complexity, invisible to the eye but essential to the plant's survival. Moss and waterfalls. Waterfalls often feature spectacular moss growth. The constant mist and spray from waterfalls create ideal conditions for moss, which responds by growing luxuriantly. Rocks beside and behind waterfalls often appear solid green, every surface coated thickly. The combination of moss and flowing water creates scenes of exceptional beauty, the green softness contrasting with the white rush of water. Moss near waterfalls tends to be especially vibrant, fed by the constant moisture and by nutrients carried in the spray. These moss gardens become destinations in themselves, drawing hikers and photographers who appreciate the lush growth. The sound of falling water combined with the visual softness of thick moss creates a multi-sensory experience of natural beauty. Standing beside such a waterfall, surrounded by green, enveloped in mist, you feel immersed in life itself, in the endless cycle of water and growth. Moss in cave entrances. Cave mouths support unique moss communities. The twilight zone at cave entrances, too dark for most plants but not completely lightless, provides habitat for specialized mosses. These species tolerate extremely low light levels, photosynthesizing on the faint illumination that reaches into the cave mouth. They also cope with high humidity and constant coolness. The moss at cave entrances often differs from species just outside, forming a distinct community adapted to these unique conditions. For cave explorers, these moss zones mark the transition from surface to underground, from the familiar world of sunlight to the strange realm of darkness. The moss clings to rock walls, softening the harsh stone, creating a last touch of green before the absolute darkness deeper in. These boundary spaces, neither fully outside nor fully inside, support life that exists nowhere else. The microscopic world of moss. Under magnification, moss reveals intricate beauty. A hand lens or microscope transforms moss from a simple green plant into an architectural wonder. Leaves show precise cellular arrangements, each cell visible as a distinct unit. The patterns vary by species. Some leaves have cells in straight rows, others in spiral or random arrangements. Reproductive structures, tiny capsules on slender stalks, reveal themselves in exquisite detail, each one a perfect miniature. The rhizoids, barely visible to the naked eye, appear under magnification as fine threads, sometimes branching, anchoring the moss with surprising strength. Observing moss at this scale reveals a world of form and function, beauty emerging from biological necessity. The precision of these tiny structures, repeated in millions of individual plants, demonstrates nature's ability to create order at every scale. Moss and forest succession. Moss plays a role in forest succession, helping new forests establish after disturbance, whether fire, landslide, or logging, moss is often among the first plants to return. It colonizes bare soil and rock, beginning the process of rebuilding the ecosystem. The moss holds moisture, reduces erosion, and starts accumulating organic matter. Other plants find it easier to establish in moss-covered areas than on bare ground. Seeds landing on moss have better survival rates, sheltered from drying winds and extreme temperatures. Over time, as trees and shrubs grow up, the moss community changes. Sun-loving species give way to shade-tolerant ones. But throughout succession, moss remains present, adapting to changing conditions, always playing a role in the forest's development. This persistence through change demonstrates moss's flexibility, its ability to thrive in many stages of forest development. The green carpet of moss. Walking on moss feels like walking on nature's carpet. The metaphor is apt. Like a carpet, moss covers floors, muffles sound, and provides cushioning. But unlike manufactured carpets, moss lives and breathes, grows and changes. It is a carpet that repairs itself, that spreads to fill gaps, that responds to seasons. In some forests, moss covers so much ground that you rarely see bare soil, walking instead on an unbroken expanse of green. This living floor transforms the forest experience, making it softer, quieter, more comfortable. It invites you to sit, to lie down, to rest directly on the earth without discomfort. The moss carpet welcomes you, yielding under your weight, then slowly recovering after you rise. It is both furniture and landscape, both decoration and essential component of the ecosystem. Moss and nitrogen fixation. Some mosses host bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen. While moss itself cannot capture nitrogen from the air, some species form partnerships with cyanobacteria that can. These bacteria live among the moss leaves, converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms the moss can use. This nitrogen fixation enriches not only the moss, but also the surrounding environment. When moss dies and decomposes, it releases nitrogen into the soil, improving fertility for other plants. In nutrient-poor environments like bogs and some forests, this nitrogen input is significant, helping support plant growth that would otherwise be limited. The partnership between moss and nitrogen-fixing bacteria is invisible but essential, another example of how life forms cooperate to survive in challenging conditions. What appears to be a simple plant is actually a complex community, moss and bacteria, working together for mutual benefit. The cooling effect of moss. Moss-covered areas stay cooler than bare ground. On hot summer days, the difference is noticeable. A patch of moss might be 10 or 15 degrees cooler than surrounding bare soil or rock. This cooling comes from several factors. The moss reflects some sunlight, rather than absorbing it as dark soil would. It holds moisture that evaporates, drawing heat away. And its structure creates insulating air spaces. For small creatures, this cooling effect is crucial. Insects, spiders, and other invertebrates seek out moss during heat waves, finding refuge from dangerous temperatures. The cooling effect also extends to the air above, with moss-covered areas contributing to lower ambient temperatures in forests. In cities, moss-covered roofs and walls provide natural cooling, reducing the urban heat island effect. Moss literally makes the world cooler, both in temperature and in its calming presence. Moss in poetry. The image of moss appears often in poetry and contemplative writing. Writers are drawn to moss for its associations: age, patience, quietness, and the gentle passage of time. A moss-covered stone becomes a metaphor for endurance. Moss growing on ruins speaks to nature's reclamation of human works. in haiku and other short forms. Moss serves as a seasonal marker and a symbol of place. The green of moss contrasts with the grey of stone, the soft with the hard, the living with the seemingly lifeless. These contrasts make moss poetically useful, allowing complex ideas to be expressed through simple images. Reading poems about moss, or writing them, connects us to a long tradition of noticing and valuing small, quiet elements of nature. The moss does not need poetry to justify its existence, but poetry needs moss to ground its abstractions in the physical world. Moss spore dispersal. Moss spores travel on wind, water, and sometimes on animals. The capsules that produce spores are designed for dispersal. Some have lids that pop off when dry, releasing spores into air currents. Others have teeth-like structures that open and close with changes in humidity, flinging spores out during dry conditions when wind dispersal is most effective. Spores are so light that they can travel long distances, crossing continents on jet stream winds. Some spores land on passing animals, hitching rides to new locations. Water also disperses spores, carrying them downstream to colonize riverbanks and lake shores. This multiple strategy approach to dispersal helps moss colonize new habitats quickly after disturbance. Despite growing slowly, moss spreads efficiently, its spores reaching far and establishing new colonies wherever conditions permit. The ethics of moss harvesting. Harvesting moss requires care to ensure sustainability. Commercial moss harvesting, primarily of sphagnum for horticulture, has raised conservation concerns in some areas. Moss grows slowly, and over-harvesting can damage ecosystems. Sustainable harvesting leaves part of each colony intact to regenerate and avoids disturbing rare species. Some regions regulate moss collection, requiring permits and setting limits. For individuals wanting to use moss in terrariums or gardens, the most ethical approach is to collect only small amounts from abundant populations, or to purchase moss from sustainable sources. Better still, many people cultivate moss rather than collecting it, starting new colonies from small samples. The increasing appreciation for moss brings responsibility to ensure that our enjoyment of it does not threaten its existence. Moss's slowness makes it vulnerable, and its value makes it worth protecting. Moss on ancient trees. Old-growth trees wear their moss like badges of age. In old forests, trees hundreds or thousands of years old are often heavily covered with moss. The thick coating speaks to the tree's age and the forest's maturity. These moss-draped elders become iconic, photographed and admired, their green coats adding to their mystique. The moss itself may be very old, colonies that established decades or centuries ago. The relationship between old trees and moss is symbiotic in a cultural sense, if not a biological one. The trees provide stable surfaces in humid environments, and the moss adds to the tree's ancient appearance, making them seem even more like living monuments. Standing before such trees, you feel a sense of reverence, partly inspired by the tree's age, but enhanced by the soft green covering that speaks of time's passage. Moss in desert oases. Even in deserts, moss finds places to grow. Desert oases and seeps, where water emerges from underground, support small moss populations. These mosses endure extreme conditions, desiccating completely during dry periods and reviving when water flows again. Desert moss grows in the most favorable microhabitats, shaded cracks in rocks, north-facing cliffs, and around springs. Though never abundant, desert moss proves that this plant can survive nearly anywhere moisture appears, even briefly. For desert travelers, the presence of moss can indicate water, a sign that moisture exists even if not immediately visible. These small green patches in vast dry landscapes become precious, markers of life's persistence against harsh odds. They remind us that water, however scarce, supports life, and that moss, patient and resilient, waits years if necessary for conditions to improve. The evening light on moss. Moss glows differently in evening light, taking on warmer tones. As the sun lowers and light becomes golden, moss transforms. The green deepens, taking on amber and bronze undertones. Shadows lengthen, emphasizing the texture and relief of moss cushions and carpets. In forests, evening light filtering through leaves casts dappled patterns on moss-covered logs and stones, creating scenes of exceptional beauty. This is a time when moss seems most peaceful, when the day's activity quiets and the forest settles into evening calm. Photographers prize this light, knowing that moss photographed at sunset or sunrise appears richer and more dimensional than in harsh midday sun. For those walking in forests at dusk, the warm glow of moss lit by evening sun creates a sense of enchantment, a feeling that the ordinary world is revealing something magical. Moss and climate change. Moss responds to climate change, shifting its distribution and abundance. As temperatures warm and precipitation patterns change, moss populations adapt or relocate. Some species expand their ranges, finding newly suitable habitats at higher elevations or latitudes. Others decline, unable to survive in warmer, drier conditions. Peatlands, those crucial carbon stores built by sphagnum moss, are particularly vulnerable. Warming and drying can cause peat to decompose, releasing stored carbon and exacerbating climate change. Scientists monitor moss as an indicator of ecosystem health, using changes in moss communities to detect environmental shifts. The fate of moss is tied to humanity's climate choices. Protecting cool, moist habitats where moss thrives becomes part of broader conservation efforts. Moss may seem insignificant, but its responses to climate change tell us much about how ecosystems are shifting. The morning dew on moss. Morning dew transforms moss into a field of jewels. Each leaf tip holds a droplet, and in early light, thousands of these droplets catch the sun, sparkling like diamonds. Walking through moss-covered areas in early morning means moving through constellations of tiny lights, each dew drop a miniature prism. This daily phenomenon illustrates moss's relationship with water. The leaves are designed to capture dew, and the water collected overnight provides moisture during the day. For insects, this dew is drinking water. For moss, it is life itself. The beauty of dew-covered moss is ephemeral, lasting only until the sun rises high enough to evaporate the droplets. But each morning, the display returns, reliable and lovely, a small daily miracle that costs nothing but waking early enough to see it. Moss in bonsai. Bonsai artists use moss to complete miniature landscapes. In bonsai, moss serves multiple purposes. It covers the soil surface, preventing erosion during watering and adding to the aesthetic. It also signals health. Thriving moss, indicating proper watering and humidity. Different moss species create different effects. Some form tight, smooth carpets, while others grow in small mounds, suggesting miniature hills. Caring for bonsai moss requires attention, keeping it moist but not waterlogged, ensuring good air circulation. The moss becomes part of the composition, complementing the tree and container, creating a complete scene that suggests a full-sized landscape in miniature. In this way, moss bridges scales, connecting the tiny world of bonsai to the vast landscapes it represents. The same species that carpets forest floors also perfects tiny artistic landscapes, versatile and beautiful in both contexts. The decay beneath moss. Beneath living moss, older layers slowly decompose. If you lift a moss cushion, you will often find brown, compressed material underneath. This is old moss that has died and is slowly breaking down. The decomposition is slow because moss contains compounds that resist decay. But gradually, with help from fungi and bacteria, the old moss becomes humus, adding to soil formation. This process means moss colonies slowly rise, building upon their own history. What seems like a thin layer may actually be quite deep, with living green on top and accumulated decomposed moss below. This self-burial demonstrates how moss creates its own substrate, how it transforms rock and wood into soil through centuries of growth and decay. The present grows upon the past, quite literally, in a moss colony. Moss and glacial retreat. As glaciers retreat, moss is among the first colonizers of newly exposed rock. Climate change is causing many glaciers to melt, uncovering landscapes that have been frozen for centuries or millennia. These barren surfaces are quickly found by moss spores. Within years, patches of moss establish on the raw rock, beginning the process of soil formation. The moss helps stabilize the surface, preventing erosion, and creates conditions for other plants to follow. This process, called primary succession, has been studied extensively near retreating glaciers. It shows how life recolonizes after ice, how bare mineral surfaces become living landscapes. Moss is a pioneer, bravely venturing onto surfaces where few other plants can survive, patiently working to make those surfaces habitable for others. It is a humble hero of ecological recovery. The varied species of moss. There are more than 12,000 species of moss worldwide. This diversity is staggering, especially for organisms so often lumped together as simply moss. Each species has its own preferred habitat, growth form, and ecological role. Some are rare, found only in specific locations. Others are widespread, occurring on multiple continents. Identifying moss species requires close observation, sometimes microscopic examination, as differences can be subtle. For dedicated enthusiasts, learning to identify mosses becomes a lifelong pursuit. Each walk in nature an opportunity to find new species or observe familiar ones in new contexts. This diversity means that moss is not one thing but 12,000 things, 12,000 variations on a theme, each beautiful and worthy of attention. Even if you never learn to identify species, knowing this diversity exists adds depth to every moss-covered stone you encounter. Moss as an air quality indicator. Moss abundance and health reflect air quality. In areas with poor air quality, especially with sulfur dioxide pollution, mosses decline or disappear. In clean air, they thrive. This makes moss a useful bioindicator. Organisms whose presence or absence indicates environmental conditions. Scientists have used moss surveys to map pollution gradients around cities and industrial sites. The reappearance of moss in formerly polluted areas signals improving air quality. Urban moss diversity can indicate which parts of a city have the cleanest air. For ordinary people, the presence of healthy moss is reassuring, a sign that the air they breathe is relatively clean. Though we cannot see pollutants, moss responds to them, providing a visible indicator of invisible dangers or, happily, their absence. Moss on volcanic rock. Volcanic rock supports distinctive moss communities. Fresh lava is initially sterile, but given time, moss colonizes it. The rough, porous texture of volcanic rock provides excellent grip for moss rhizoids, and the rock's mineral content, once weathering begins to release it, provides nutrients. On older lava flows, moss can be abundant, covering the dark rock with bright green. The contrast between black basalt and vivid moss is striking, creating landscapes of dramatic beauty. These mosses are specialists, tolerant of the harsh conditions volcanic rock presents. Studying moss on lava flows of different ages shows how ecosystems develop over time, from bare rock to fully vegetated landscapes. Moss is a key player in this transformation, one of the first living things to claim the new land. The moisture gradient in moss. Within a moss colony, moisture varies from top to bottom. The upper layers dry out faster, while deeper layers stay moist. This gradient creates different microclimates within the same patch. Creatures can move vertically through the moss to find their preferred moisture level. For the moss itself, the gradient means that even if the surface dries, the base remains hydrated, allowing the colony to survive short, dry periods. This internal complexity makes moss more than a simple mat. It is a three-dimensional habitat with varying conditions, supporting different organisms at different depths. Understanding this gradient helps explain why moss harbors such diversity. It is not one habitat but several, stacked vertically in a space perhaps only centimeters deep. Moss in traditional crafts. Moss has been used in traditional crafts and practices. Beyond insulation, moss has served many purposes. Indigenous peoples used moss for diapers and feminine hygiene products, valuing its absorbency and softness. Some cultures stuffed pillows and mattresses with dried moss. Moss was used as packing material for fragile items, protecting them during transport. In floristry, moss adds texture and color to arrangements. Crafters use moss in wreaths, fairy gardens, and other decorative projects. These uses honor moss's properties, absorbency, softness, and beauty, while making practical use of an abundant resource. Today, most such uses rely on sustainably harvested or cultivated moss, reflecting growing awareness of conservation needs. Traditional knowledge about moss represents accumulated wisdom, generations learning what this small plant could provide. The green wave of spring. Spring moss growth moves up mountains like a green wave. In mountains, spring arrives at different times at different elevations. Snow melts first in valleys, later on peaks. Moss responds to this gradient, beginning active growth as soon as conditions permit. If you could watch from above, you would see a wave of greening moss moving up the mountain as spring advances. This phenological response demonstrates moss's sensitivity to temperature and moisture. It also shows how mountains create multiple growing seasons in close proximity, with valley moss finishing spring growth, while alpine moss is just beginning. For hikers moving up mountains in spring, they walk backward through the seasons, from full spring in the valleys to late winter on the peaks, with moss marking the transitions. Moss and forest fires. Some mosses survive fire by resprouting from protected parts. While most moss burns in forest fires, it recovers quickly afterward. Spores from surviving moss in unburned patches colonize the burned area rapidly. Some species have portions of their structure, rhizoids or underground fragments, that survive fire and resprout. Within a year or two of a fire, moss often covers the ground again, faster than many other plants. This quick recovery is ecologically important, stabilizing soil and retaining moisture in the burned landscape. The post-fire moss community may differ from the pre-fire one, with pioneer species dominating at first, but over time, as the forest regenerates, the moss community matures as well. Fire is part of the natural cycle in many forests, and moss has evolved strategies to persist through and recover from burning. The comfort of moss. There is psychological comfort in the presence of moss. Research suggests that viewing green plants reduces stress and promotes relaxation. Moss with its soft texture and quiet presence, enhances these effects. Spaces with abundant moss feel calmer, gentler, more restful. This may be partly cultural, associations built through stories and experiences, but it may also be innate, a response to the signs of moisture and shelter that moss represents. In stressful times, people often seek nature, and moss-covered places offer nature at its most approachable and soothing. You need no special knowledge to appreciate moss, no equipment to enjoy it. Simply being in its presence, seeing it, touching it, breathing the humid air it creates, these simple experiences provide comfort. Moss asks nothing and offers peace, a generous exchange. Moss in the fossil record. Fossil moss has been found dating back hundreds of millions of years. Preserved in amber, compressed in ancient sediments, or mineralized in fine detail, fossil moss provides a window into ancient ecosystems. These fossils show that moss has remained remarkably unchanged for immense spans of time. Forms that lived 300 million years ago would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern moss. This constancy suggests that moss perfected its design early and found no need to change. While the world around it transformed dramatically, with the rise and fall of dinosaurs, the evolution of flowering plants, and the emergence of mammals, moss continued much as it always had. This makes living moss a link to ancient worlds, a survivor carrying forward a form that worked well in the deep past and works well today. The whisper of wind in moss. Wind moving through moss makes a sound softer than a whisper. In most plants, wind creates sound, rustling through leaves, but moss has no leaves large enough to rustle. Instead, wind moves silently through moss, or nearly so. The sound it makes is felt as much as heard, a stirring of air, a faint susurration. This quietness contributes to the peace of moss-covered places. Even on windy days, mossy spots seem calm, sheltered from the noise of moving air. For those seeking solitude, these quiet refuges offer respite. The wind continues overhead, in the canopy, but among the moss, all is still. This creates a sense of separation from the world's noise, a feeling of being in a protected space where stillness prevails. Moss and tardigrades. Moss provides essential habitat for tardigrades, the microscopic water bears. These tiny creatures, less than a millimeter long, live among moss leaves, moving through the water film that coats the plants. Tardigrades feed on moss cells, using their sharp mouths to puncture cell walls and suck out the contents. They are incredibly resilient, capable of surviving extreme heat, cold, radiation, and even the vacuum of space by entering a dormant state. When moss dries out, tardigrades desiccate with it, reviving when water returns. This partnership, moss and tardigrade, represents life at a different scale. To the tardigrade, moss is a vast forest, each leaf a tree. Studying tardigrades in moss reveals a complete ecosystem invisible to the naked eye, a reminder that our perspective is limited, that worlds within worlds exist all around us. The touch of frost on moss. Frost transforms moss into a crystalline landscape. On cold mornings, frost forms on moss, coating every leaf with ice crystals. The transformation is complete. Green becomes white, soft becomes brittle, and the moss seems frozen in time. But this freezing is temporary and usually harmless. As the sun rises and temperatures climb, the frost melts and the moss returns to its normal state. Some mosses are adapted to freeze repeatedly without damage, their cells protected by special compounds that prevent ice crystal formation inside the cell walls. The frost on moss creates scenes of delicate beauty. white on green, ice-catching morning light. For photographers, these frosty mornings are treasured opportunities. For moss, they are simply another challenge, faced and endured. Moss at the water's edge. Moss thrives where water and land meet, along streams, around ponds, and at lake edges. Moss flourishes in the consistent moisture. These mosses tolerate occasional flooding, surviving even when submerged for days. When water recedes, they resume growth immediately. The moss at water's edge helps stabilize banks, preventing erosion. Its roots, though shallow, bind soil, and its covering slows the impact of waves and currents. Fish and amphibians benefit from streamside moss, which shades the water, keeping it cool, and provides habitat for aquatic insects that serve as food. The moss creates a gradual transition between aquatic and terrestrial environments, a buffer zone where elements of both worlds combine. Standing at water's edge where moss grows thick, you feel balanced between elements, between flowing water and solid ground. The silence of moss growth. Moss grows without sound, its expansion invisible and inaudible. In forests full of sound, bird calls, insect buzzes, wind in leaves, moss is silent. It does not announce its presence or draw attention to itself. Its growth happens in quiet, a leaf added here, a new shoot there, with no fanfare. This silence is part of moss's character, its humility. It transforms landscapes without noise, without urgency. It simply persists, and over time, the persistence accumulates into visible change. For those who value quiet, moss represents an ideal. It succeeds through patience rather than aggression, through steady work rather than dramatic gestures. In a noisy world, the silence of moss is a balm, a reminder that not everything needs to announce itself to be important. Moss as a memory of place. Moss connects us to places we have been, triggering memories of forests visited, stones touched. Encountering moss in new locations can trigger recollections of other mossy places, creating connections across geography and time. The smell of wet moss might transport you to a particular forest trail. The feel of a moss cushion might recall a moment of rest on a mountain hike. These memories, triggered by the senses, are often vivid and emotional. Moss becomes a thread linking experiences, a common element in diverse locations. For some people, moss itself becomes a destination, something sought out and celebrated. Moss enthusiasts travel to famous moss gardens, hike to moss-covered waterfalls, and seek out old forests where moss grows thick. Each moss-covered place becomes a memory, a moment of connection with the quiet green world. Moss and the moon. Moss grows no differently during different moon phases. Despite folklore, old traditions claim that planting by the moon affects growth, and some extend this belief to moss. But moss shows no response to lunar cycles. Its growth depends on moisture, temperature, and light, none of which vary meaningfully with moon phases. The persistence of such beliefs reflects humanity's tendency to see patterns and connections, to link earthly and celestial rhythms. While moon phases do not affect moss, moonlight itself does illuminate moss-covered landscapes beautifully. Walking through moss-covered forests under a full moon reveals the green even in darkness, the moss catching and softly reflecting the pale light. Moon and moss may not be connected biologically, but aesthetically they pair well. The soft light, perfect for the soft plant. The resilience after disturbance. Moss recovers from disturbance, given time and moisture. A foot crushing moss, a branch falling on it. These disturbances damage, but rarely kill. The moss compresses. Some leaves break, but the rhizoids remain. the main stems survive. Within days or weeks, the moss recovers, damaged parts replaced by new growth. Even when moss is torn away, fragments can regenerate if conditions are right. This resilience makes moss adaptable to places with moderate disturbance. It cannot survive heavy foot traffic, but occasional impacts it handles well. In forests, moss constantly experiences small disturbances, animals walking over it, debris falling on it, and it continuously recovers. This quiet toughness, the ability to be pressed down and rise again, makes moss a survivor. It bends but does not break, yields but does not surrender. Moss in ancient architecture. Ancient buildings often feature moss growth that enhances their character. Temples, castles, and ruins around the world wear coats of moss that add to their gravitas. The moss speaks to age, suggesting that these structures have stood long enough for nature to claim them partially. Moss softens hard stone, adding color and texture to walls and sculptures. Some historic sites maintain the moss, recognizing its contribution to the site's atmosphere. Others remove it, fearing damage to mortar and stone. The debate between preservation and removal continues, balancing aesthetic and historical value against conservation concerns. For visitors, moss-covered ruins evoke romanticism and melancholy, beauty tinged with awareness of time's passage. The moss becomes part of the story, a living narrator of the years that have passed since human hands last shaped the stone. The efficiency of moss. Moss is remarkably efficient at using resources. It wastes little, growing slowly but steadily, requiring minimal nutrients, surviving on what falls from the sky. This efficiency makes moss successful in poor environments where other plants starve. It does not invest in elaborate root systems or woody stems. Every part of the plant contributes to photosynthesis. There are no wasteful structures, no parts that do not serve essential functions. This stripped-down efficiency is elegant, a study in doing more with less. In a time when efficiency is valued, moss is a model, proving that simplicity and effectiveness go together, that complexity is not always necessary for success. Moss achieves its goals with minimal resources, an example worth contemplating. Moss and shade. Moss thrives in shade where many plants struggle. Deep forest understories, the north sides of trees and buildings, the sheltered spaces beneath overhangs. These shaded places suit moss perfectly. Its adaptation to low light allows it to occupy niches other plants cannot, reducing competition. In full sun, moss can struggle, drying out quickly and suffering from overheating. But in shade, it excels. This preference shapes forest ecosystems. The shaded forest floor becomes moss territory, while sunny clearings favor other plants. The result is diversity. Different plants in different light conditions, more species fitting into the landscape. Moss's love of shade also affects how we experience mossy places. They tend to be cool, dark, and quiet, creating a particular mood. Walking from sunlit spaces into moss-covered shade feels like entering a different world, softer and more hushed. The seasonal changes in moss. Though evergreen, moss changes subtly with seasons. In spring, new growth is brightest, fresh tips glowing green. In summer, moss may brown slightly during dry spells, though it revives with rain. Autumn brings slower growth as days shorten and temperatures drop. Winter dormancy follows, the moss waiting beneath snow or frost. These changes are subtle compared to deciduous trees' dramatic transformations, but they are real. Observing moss through the year reveals these rhythms, deepening appreciation for its life cycle. Seasonal changes in moss also affect the creatures depending on it. Insects become dormant when moss dries or freezes. Salamanders retreat to deeper shelter. The moss community breathes with the seasons, expanding and contracting in activity. Through these cycles, moss persists, adapting to each season's conditions. Moss and lightning. Lightning-struck trees often support exceptional moss growth. When lightning strikes a tree, it can damage bark and wood, creating crevices and roughening surfaces. These changes create ideal moss habitat. Moisture collects in the new cracks, and rough bark provides better attachment points. Years after a strike, the affected tree may wear a thick coat of moss, marking where lightning touched. This association between lightning and moss is coincidental, not causal. The moss does not care about lightning, only about the habitat the strike created. But the pattern is noticeable, especially in forests, where lightning is common. Trees bearing lightning scars become green monuments, their moss coats testifying to survival. They remind us that disturbance can create opportunity, that damage sometimes leads to new growth. The moss garden path. Walking paths through moss gardens create meditative experiences. Japanese moss gardens often include winding paths, designed to slow visitors and encourage observation. Each turn reveals new views, different moss species, varied compositions of stone and green. The paths are narrow, inviting single-file walking and contemplation rather than conversation. The gravel or stone of the path contrasts with the soft moss, heightening awareness of texture. Walking such paths becomes a practice, a form of moving meditation. Your pace slows naturally. Your gaze drops to the ground, noticing detail. Thought quiets. By the path's end, you are calmer, more centered. The moss has worked its magic, not through any active effort, but simply by being itself, by inviting you to slow down and notice. Moss and the sense of scale. Moss makes the small seem large, and the large seem small. Looking closely at moss, entering its world imaginatively, gives a sense of vastness. Each tiny leaf becomes a surface to explore, each stem a column. The landscape of a moss cushion mirrors the topography of mountains and valleys, just at a different scale. This shift in perspective can be profound, making us aware of how scale shapes perception. Conversely, moss on large objects, boulders, cliffs, makes them seem even more massive. The contrast between tiny plants and huge stones, emphasizing the difference in size. Playing with scale in this way stretches imagination, encourages seeing familiar things in new ways. Moss becomes a tool for expanding awareness, for recognizing that size is relative and that every scale holds beauty and complexity. The green bridge. Moss bridges gaps between rocks and logs, connecting the forest. Where a fallen tree touches a boulder, moss grows at the junction, covering both surfaces and creating continuity. Where two stones sit close together, moss fills the space between, linking them. These moss bridges are small but significant. They create pathways for tiny creatures, highways through the forest floor. They prevent soil from eroding between rocks. They hold moisture in the gaps, creating micro-habitats. Metaphorically, moss bridges different elements of the forest, linking stone to wood, ground to tree, creating a unified landscape from diverse parts. This connecting role makes moss ecologically important. It is the glue that holds landscapes together, the soft tissue between harder structures, essential to the forest's integrity. Moss and human health. Spending time around moss may benefit human health. Research on forest bathing, the Japanese practice of spending time in nature, suggests health benefits: reduced stress, lower blood pressure, improved mood. Moss-rich environments are ideal for forest bathing. The softness underfoot reduces physical strain, The humidity benefits respiratory systems. The quiet promotes relaxation. The green color soothes eyes. Though no studies specifically isolate moss's contribution, mossy forests consistently rate high in the qualities that make nature therapeutic. People report feeling refreshed and restored after time in such places. Whether the moss itself matters, or whether it simply indicates the kind of environment that promotes health, the correlation exists. Moss and human well-being are linked, at least experientially, if not yet scientifically proven. The moss time capsule. Layers in moss cushions preserve a chronological record. Like tree rings, moss growth creates layers, though much less distinct. The top is newest, the bottom oldest. Scientists can sometimes date these layers, reconstructing the moss's history and the environmental conditions it experienced. Changes in growth rate, visible in layer thickness, might reflect wet or dry years. Trapped pollen grains reveal what plants were flowering nearby. This makes old moss cushions archives of local history, biological time capsules. Reading these layers requires expertise and careful lab work, but the information is there, preserved in the humble cushion. Each moss colony holds stories, if we develop the skill to read them. The unassuming green pillow becomes a library, a record of decades or centuries available to those who know how to look. Moss and the concept of home. Moss reminds us that home is where conditions are right. Moss has no single home. It thrives wherever moisture, shade, and substrate align. This flexibility challenges notions of fixed homes. For moss, home is a set of conditions, not a location. When those conditions exist, moss makes a home. When they vanish, moss departs or goes dormant. This adaptability is worth contemplating. What makes a place home? Is it the place itself, or the conditions it provides? Safety, comfort, sustenance? Moss suggests the latter. Home is not where you are, but where you can live well. This idea resonates in a mobile world where people often move, seeking conditions that suit them. Like moss, we search for the right fit between our needs and environment. Finding that fit, we thrive. Losing it, we move or endure, waiting for conditions to improve. The gift of moss. Moss gives more than it takes from its environment. It produces oxygen through photosynthesis. It creates habitat for countless small creatures. It retains moisture and regulates temperature. It filters water and air. It stabilizes soil and prevents erosion. What does it require in return? Just moisture, a surface, and a bit of light. The exchange is generous. Moss contributes far more than it consumes, a net positive for every ecosystem it inhabits. This generosity makes moss a valuable community member, beloved by ecologists and naturalists. In a world where we often focus on what we can extract from nature, moss offers a different model, one of giving more than taking, of enriching environments simply by existing. It is a lesson in generosity, taught by the quietest of teachers. The moss beneath snow. Beneath winter snow, moss waits in darkness. The snow covers it completely, cutting off light. But moss does not mind. It enters dormancy, reducing its metabolic activity to almost nothing. Beneath the snow, temperatures are actually more stable than on the surface, the snow acting as insulation against extreme cold. The moss waits, patient as always, for the snow to melt and spring to return. When that happens, it resumes growth immediately, having lost nothing by the long darkness. For animals, the space beneath the snow where moss grows provides refuge. Small mammals burrow through, finding seeds and insects. The moss creates structure in this subnivean zone, the secret winter world beneath the white blanket. Snow and moss together create conditions, where life persists through winter's harshness. Invisible but enduring, the future of moss. Climate change threatens some moss species, while potentially benefiting others. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, the distribution of moss will change. Species adapted to cool, moist conditions may contract to smaller ranges, perhaps persisting only in refugia, places where conditions remain suitable. Other species, those tolerant of warmth and drought, may expand. New moss communities will develop, different from historical ones. Peatlands face particular risk, their vast carbon stores vulnerable to drying and fire. Conserving moss in a changing climate requires protecting diverse habitats, including high-altitude and high-latitude areas that may serve as future refuges. It also requires addressing climate change itself, reducing emissions to limit warming. The future of moss is uncertain, like the future of much biodiversity. But moss has survived dramatic changes before, and its adaptability suggests it will persist in some form, continuing its patient presence on Earth. Moss and stillness. In moss-covered places, stillness becomes tangible. It is not just the absence of movement, but a presence in itself, something you can feel. The moss seems to embody this stillness, each cushion and carpet a manifestation of patience and rest. Sitting in such a place, you absorb this quality. Your own restlessness quiets, thoughts slow. The urge to move or speak diminishes. You become, for a moment, as still as the moss, participating in its ancient patience. This experience of stillness is increasingly rare in modern life, and increasingly precious. Moss offers it freely to anyone willing to sit, to be quiet, to let the green silence work its subtle magic. The touch of rain on moss. Each raindrop landing on moss is absorbed gently. Unlike the splash of rain on hard surfaces, drops landing on moss sink in with barely a sound. The moss receives the water gratefully, swelling slightly, its color deepening. Watching rain fall on moss is meditative, each drop disappearing into green, the moss slowly transforming from dull to vibrant. The air fills with the smell of wet moss, earthy and clean. In heavy rain, moss can become saturated, holding as much water as possible, small streams running between the cushions where the ground underneath cannot absorb more. But the moss itself never seems overwhelmed. It simply holds what it can and lets the rest flow on. This acceptance, taking what you can and releasing what you cannot hold, is another lesson moss teaches. Moss as a companion. Though it cannot move or speak, moss feels like a companion. People who spend time with moss often develop a fondness for it, a sense of connection. This might seem strange, befriending a plant that does not respond, but the connection is real. The moss accompanies you through the forest, marks your favorite sitting spots, greets you when you return to familiar places. Its constancy is comforting. Unlike friendships that end or change, the moss remains, doing what it has always done, growing slowly, being green. This reliability makes it a trustworthy companion, one that asks nothing but your attention and offers in return its quiet presence. For solitary people, for those who find peace in nature, moss becomes a friend. The green constancy. Moss provides visual stability in changing landscapes. While forests transform with seasons, trees leafing out and going bare, underbrush flowering and dying back, moss remains relatively constant. Its evergreen nature means it is always there, always green, a reliable visual anchor. This constancy helps orient forest travelers. Recognizing particular moss-covered logs or stones becomes a way of knowing where you are. The moss marks places, providing landmarks in landscapes that otherwise shift and change. This stability extends psychologically. In a changing world, moss represents something enduring, something that persists through change without losing its essential nature. It is a visual promise that not everything is temporary, that some things, however small, can be counted on. Moss and childhood. Many people's first encounters with moss happen in childhood. Children are drawn to moss naturally. It feels good to touch, looks inviting to sit on, and its small scale suits their size. Building fairy houses, creating tiny worlds, using moss as landscaping for imaginary scenarios. These childhood activities forge connections between people and moss. Adults who loved moss as children often carry that affection forward, seeking it out, feeling joy when they encounter particularly beautiful specimens. This childhood bond is worth cultivating, encouraging children to notice and appreciate moss plants, seeds of environmental awareness, teaching them to value small, overlooked elements of nature. It also gives them peaceful memories, associations between moss and calm, play, and wonder that last a lifetime. The moss night. At night, moss-covered forests feel different than by day. The green is invisible in darkness, but the softness underfoot remains. Walking through such places at night requires trust. Each step taken on faith that the ground will be soft and forgiving. The moss absorbs sound even more completely in the stillness of night, footsteps barely audible. Nocturnal creatures use the moss, hunting in its cover or sheltering under its protective layers. The forest at night becomes a different place, mysterious and slightly strange, and the moss is part of that transformation, invisible but present, felt but not seen. Standing still in a moss-covered forest at night, surrounded by darkness and soft silence, you feel connected to something ancient and patient, to the long, slow rhythms of growth and rest, moss and gratitude. Moss invites gratitude for small, simple things. It asks us to notice what we might otherwise overlook, to appreciate beauty that does not demand attention, to value life that serves quietly. Practicing gratitude for moss, noticing it, and feeling thankful for its presence extends naturally to gratitude for other small things. The habit of noticing and appreciating moss can shift perspective, helping us see value in ordinary, humble elements of life. This shift is psychologically beneficial, fostering contentment and wonder. Moss does not know we are grateful, but our gratitude changes us, making us more attentive, more appreciative, more aware of the abundance of small goods surrounding us. In this way, moss becomes a spiritual teacher, not through any intention of its own, but simply by being worth noticing and appreciating. The final moss. At journey's end, moss provides a soft place to rest. In metaphorical terms, moss represents the final resting place, the return to earth. Bodies buried in forests eventually become covered with moss, returning to the landscape that sustained them. This may sound morbid, but there is comfort in it. The moss treats all surfaces the same, covering stone and soil, wood and bone, with equal care. To become part of a moss-covered landscape is to become part of something beautiful and alive, to contribute to the green continuity. Of course, most people will not rest in moss-covered forests, but the metaphor holds value. At the end of effort, at the end of journey, moss represents arrival at a place of peace, a soft landing, a gentle end. It suggests that rest, when it comes, will be kind, the dream of moss. In dreams, moss often represents growth, patience, and natural processes. Dream interpretation is subjective, but mossy dreams tend to feel peaceful. Dreaming of moss-covered places suggests connection to nature, need for rest, or appreciation for slow, steady progress. Walking through moss in dreams often feels effortless and calming. The moss in dreams might symbolize the dreamer's own patient work, growth that is happening slowly but surely, results that accumulate over time, or it might represent a desire for such qualities, a longing for patience in a rushed life. Whether analyzed or simply enjoyed, mossy dreams tend to be pleasant, carrying the same quiet peace that moss provides in waking life. The dream moss works the same magic as real moss, offering rest and green calm. The sound of silence. Moss embodies silence in its purest form. It does not merely exist in silence but seems to create it, to radiate quiet. This is partly acoustic, the sound-absorbing properties of its structure, but it is also aesthetic and psychological. Looking at moss feels quiet. Touching it feels quiet. Even thinking about moss invokes quiet. This quality makes moss valuable in sound-filled lives. It offers a visual and tactile reminder that silence exists, that quiet is real and accessible. In meditation practices, moss or images of moss can serve as focal points, objects that help quiet the mind. The moss demands nothing, offers everything, and in doing so becomes a perfect symbol and source of silence. In a world of noise, moss is profoundly quiet, and in that quietness, profoundly powerful. The green sleep. As sleep approaches, thoughts soften like moss. The transition from waking to sleeping feels like sinking into a moss cushion, a gentle yielding, a soft embrace. Consciousness releases its grip. Thoughts blur and drift. The boundaries between self and surroundings soften. This is the green sleep. Rest that feels like becoming part of the forest floor, like being held by something ancient and patient. The moss has waited all day for this moment, for you to finally rest, to let go of effort and planning, to simply exist as the moss exists, present and peaceful. In this moment between waking and sleep, you are neither fully here nor fully gone, suspended in the soft green space where moss grows best, where silence lives, where time moves slowly or stops altogether. The eternal return. Each morning, the moss is there, unchanged and faithful. After sleep, after dreams, after the night's unknowable journey, you return to find the moss exactly as you left it. This reliability is profound. In a world where much changes or disappears, the moss endures. It will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Years from now, if you return to the same forest, the same moss-covered log, it will likely still be there, a little larger perhaps, but essentially the same. This eternal return, this faithful presence, offers deep comfort. It suggests that some things can be trusted, that not everything is temporary, that patience and persistence create something lasting. The moss teaches that you can leave and return, sleep and wake, and find the world still there, still green, still soft, still waiting. And so we rest. And so, dear listener, our journey through the world of moss comes to a close. From the ancient rocks it colonises to the forests it softens. From the water it holds to the creatures it shelters. We have wandered through this quiet green universe together. We have learned that moss is both simple and complex, ancient yet ever-present, small yet mighty. It has shown us patience, resilience, and the beauty of slowness. It has invited us to notice the overlooked, to appreciate the humble, to find peace in softness. As you lie here now, letting your breath fall into an easy rhythm, imagine yourself in a moss-covered forest. Picture the soft green beneath you, yielding to your weight, supporting you with gentle firmness. Feel the cool humidity in the air, the filtered light creating a green glow around you. Hear the silence, profound and complete, broken only by the occasional drip of water from leaves above, landing on moss with the softest of sounds. Smell the earthy richness, the scent of growth and life, of patience and time. See yourself resting on this ancient carpet, this living mattress that has been growing for longer than you have lived, that will continue growing after you rise and leave. Feel yourself held by something that asks nothing of you, that simply exists, simply grows, simply is. The moss does not judge or demand. It only receives, accepts, holds. And in holding you, it offers its greatest gift, the permission to rest completely, to let go of effort, to sink into peace. The moss has been here for hundreds of millions of years. It witnessed the first forests, survived extinctions, persisted through ice ages and warming periods. It has outlasted civilizations, empires, and species beyond counting, and it will continue long after we are gone, patiently growing, silently spreading, covering the earth in soft green. This deep time perspective makes our troubles seem smaller, our worries less urgent. What matters in a moment becomes less significant when measured against moss time. So rest now, as the moss rests. Grow, slowly and steadily, even in sleep. Hold water, holding within yourself the resources you need. Let your edges soften, yielding to what surrounds you. Be patient with your own growth, knowing that the most lasting things develop slowly. Be resilient, able to endure dry periods and cold seasons, trusting that better conditions will return. Be humble, finding success not in height or showiness, but in persistence and presence. The moss asks nothing, but offers everything. It teaches without speaking, comforts without moving, persists without effort. It is the master of quiet existence, and in its presence, we learn to be quiet too. Our thoughts slow to moss speed. Our breathing softens to match its gentle rhythm. Our bodies relax into its soft support. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and continue to the next video when you are ready. But if your eyes are growing heavy, let the quiet green world of moss hold you. Let the ancient patience of this small plant remind you that you too can rest, can let go, can trust that tomorrow will come and you will wake, just as the moss will still be there, green and soft and waiting. Close your eyes now. Breathe deeply. Feel yourself sinking into softness, into green, into silence. Let the moss carry you down into sleep, into rest, into the deep green quiet where growth happens without effort and time moves at its own perfect pace. Good night. Rest well. The moss will keep watch, as it always has, patient and faithful, soft and green, now and forever. Sleep now. The moss waits. Sleep.